I call the honourable member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And yes, the House will be taking these 4 bills as introduced by the Minister together, and I'll speak to them generally, but first of all indicate that the opposition will be supporting the package of bills. Australia's agriculture sector, of course, is a vital part of the Australian economy. The export of agricultural goods are forecast to be worth a value of $40 billion this financial year. The Department of Agriculture plays a significant role in supporting farmers and exporters and in maintaining international market access. Access for Australian agricultural exports relies on the Department's certification, inspection and auditing activities that provides assurance to other countries that their import requirements are met. Last year alone, the Department issued around 300,000 export certificates covering meat, grain, horticulture and fibre products. It also provided inspection and certification for the export of over 3.1 million live animals. It's not my intention to go through the detail of each of the bills. The Minister has done so in his second reading contribution. But to put that in more simple terms, Mr Deputy Speaker, for those who might be listening to the debate, the bills that will follow this package of bills will do something very similar, except that they will deal with the importation of goods rather than the exportation. And of course, the Department, both on import and export, does certify products. For example, when we are exporting meat to China, the Chinese authorities want to know that it meets the standards they require. Therefore, it's for the Department of Agriculture to provide those certifications, and of course there are significant costs involved in that process. And rather than those costs be met by the Australian taxpayer, we have a system in which we recover those costs from the exporting company. And basically that's what this bill is about, and later the same applies to the importation of goods. We Australians expect the Department of Agriculture to ensure that the goods being imported are of a certain standard, and of course that the health needs of Australians are being protected. Again, there is a cost in that process and that certification, and those costs are again recovered from the importing company. So what these bills do is deal with those issues, are tidying up, and regulations allow charges to be set. So again, the opposition, of course, will be supporting them. We do so with enthusiasm. It's a step in the right direction, and it's something we would expect of the government of the day. I want to talk about agriculture more generally, because as insignificant as these bills might seem at first glance, they are very important and are part of the very many building blocks which form part of a successful agriculture sector in this country. As I said earlier, a very, very important sector. In fact, it's now becoming almost part of the Australian vernacular to talk about the dining boom. That is, as we see the mining boom tapering off, our hopes of experiencing something very significant with the growing demand for food around the globe, particularly in Asia, and of course amongst the growing middle classes of Asia. So we're moving from the mining boom, I hope, to the dining boom, and I take this opportunity to say I would also like to think that we're moving to the fibre boom. The opportunities which will be presented to us for forest-based product demand in Asia, in particular, as we see research and development creating new opportunities from wood to plastics, wood to biofuels, etc. And with the right strategic plans and leadership from government, there will be significant opportunities for Australia in that space as well. But I've often said, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the dining boom won't come to us. It will be up to us to go to it. In other words, it is a very competitive market, despite the a huge demand before us. But what's important for Australia, of course, is price value, not so much volume. Minister Joyce and I agree on one thing absolutely, and that is Australia will never be the food bowl of Asia, because food bowl implies that we will be a very substantial provider of food. And it's often been noted that even if we tripled our food output tomorrow, we wouldn't even feed Indonesia and Australia, let alone the rest of Asia. So volume will not be our business, although increasing volume will be important. Our real business will be value, securing higher returns at the higher end of the market, capitalising on our reputation as a clean, green, safe producer and provider of food. And I do note that my friends on the other side of the House are nodding in agreement on that point, and I'm glad that is the case. Minister Joyce and I have said on many occasions the more bipartisanship we can have in agriculture, the better, because it's a sector which we can't afford to have locked up in the 3-year political cycle. It's a sector that requires long-term investment and planning and the right strategic guidance of government. And if we can strike bipartisan approaches to these things, then agriculture will have continuity in that long-term strategic planning, and that will be all important. But I talked about these bills as a building block to agriculture's future success, but it's one of many. And I'd just like to talk about a few of the others. We won't fully capitalise on those opportunities in Asia in particular without focusing on I'll make 5 points. The financial capital we will require to fully realise our dreams, that is the money that will be required to build the infrastructure, to have the investment and output required, the supply chains, etc. Human capital, that is the people and the skills of people on the land and along the supply chain, ensuring that we do have the skills, and that goes back to education, including tertiary education. Natural resources capital, that is the land, the soils, the water and the natural elements we rely upon in the farm sector. Infrastructure capital, I've mentioned it already through financing, but obviously we can't be competitive in the global market without efficient supply chains and the infrastructure which is critical to that, the road, the rail, the ports, the dams, etc. Research capital, maybe the most critical and important component. How we innovate, how we get ahead of the game, how we ensure we're at the high value end of the curve, not the low value end of the curve. How we produce more food with the same limited natural resources, and in fact depleting natural resources. These 5 points are so important to our future success. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, if I can just depart from bipartisanship for a moment, I do remind the House that we've been now almost 2 years now under this government without an agriculture policy. 2 years without an agriculture policy. Now, if the minister was at the dispatch box opposite, he'd say, "Oh, we've got 3 free trade agreements." I acknowledge that. We've got 3 free trade agreements. Negotiations commenced by the former Labor government, which they completed in government. There were good reasons Labor was hastening slowly, and some of those reasons will be teased out, I suspect, over the coming months as we talk about investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms, we talk about labour market agreements and how they might impact on this country. But Labor welcomes the signing of the agreements, and we are pleased that they are complete. We'd like to see them, by the way. That would be helpful. If we had that opportunity, we might give them even stronger endorsement. But I do accept in any case that this government has now signed off on those 3 agreements. So Minister Joyce can and will continue to claim that, but not his portfolio, not his portfolio, Minister Robb's portfolio. And I go back to his own achievements. Nothing. Nothing. Although I do acknowledge some depreciation schedule changes in the budget, which I welcome. But in terms of strategic guidance and overarching agriculture policy, nothing. 2 years without an agriculture policy. And while we fiddle as a country in agriculture policy, our competitors are on the march, South Americans in particular. They're not waiting for their white paper. They are on the march right now for a while. I'll just indicate to the member for Parkes? No, Calare, sorry. Calare, that I'll probably go for another 15 minutes or so, I suspect. That they are on the march while we fiddle. Our counterparts across the ditch in New Zealand, same. They have real goals and objectives and strategic plans to capitalise on the opportunities in Asia, way ahead of the game, way beyond where we are in this game, particularly in dairy, as people well know. So 2 years without a policy. It's a problem, and it's a disappointment, a great disappointment to everyone out there in the agriculture sector and indeed the agri-food sector, who had high hopes, having been promised so much prior to the election, high hopes of this government, who remain now bitterly disappointed. I want to make a couple of points on some of those foundations I laid down. Australia is a small, well, not small island continent, it's a large island continent with a very small population, around 23 million people. Therefore, we have a very limited savings capacity. And for that reason, as a nation, all of our lives, indeed, since the first fleet arrived, we've relied heavily on the capital of those in other countries. Traditionally, it came mainly or largely from our Western friends in the UK, the US, Canada. Over the years that's changed, but they still predominantly, even New Zealand, predominantly are our providers of foreign capital. But of course, as Asia and the Indo-Pacific generally continues to emerge, some of that capital is coming from other nations, China, for example. And that's a good thing for Australia. It's good news for Australia. Very good news for Australia. It's well known in this place that the member for Hume was one of the primary authors of a great ANZ report, ANZ Port Jackson Partners report, entitled Feeding Our Future. Now, I don't know how robust his numbers are. I've never had the chance to get behind his methodology, but it suggested in that report that to fully capitalise on the dining boom, Australia will need $600 billion, that's billion with a B, $600 billion worth of investment in infrastructure. I'm glad the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure is with us because he understands this very well, if we are to fully capitalise on the dining boom. So let's just assume the member for Hume is only half right and it's only $300 billion. It's still a very, very significant amount of money, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it's axiomatic that it's not going to come from Australian savings. Yes, we need to do more to get the super funds more engaged and involved in agriculture, and we should all be working towards that objective. But it's never going to be enough. We will be very heavily dependent on foreign capital. And we shouldn't be concerning ourselves, Mr Deputy Speaker, about where the capital comes from. Chinese money is as good as US money, or money coming from Canada. It's all important to us. And I'm really concerned, Mr Deputy Speaker, that this government, for the first time, is implementing in this country a discriminatory foreign investment approach. We now have different rules for different countries. Coincidentally, maybe, we have different rules for Asia than we do for the American continent, for example. Different rules for Asia than for the Americans and the Canadians, and indeed the New Zealanders. In fact, now, under the current government's arrangements, if you want to buy some agricultural land, if you're Asian, you'll go to the Foreign Investment Review Board if the value of the land is more than $15 million. If you are an American or Canadian or Kiwi, you go if it's less than $1 billion, or more than $1 billion, sorry. Now, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it certainly sends the wrong signals to potential investors in Australian agriculture in a global market where competition is intense. A lot of money is flowing into South America, and people are sitting back and they're saying, well, I can invest in Australian agriculture, or I can invest in South America, for example. And they'll go where They'll take the path of least resistance. Of course they will. Not only that, Mr Deputy Speaker, but the government is now planning to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from fees to applicants, drawn from applicants who want to invest in this country. Big fees, Mr Deputy Speaker. In fact, I was talking to the principal of Wellards, the live export company, very successful company, run by an Italian who lives in Australia, but not as an Australian citizen. But he lives in Australia, has his home in Australia, his kids go to school in Australia, and he employs hundreds of people in Australia because his business goes right through to feedlots and, of course, abattoirs. Now, this gentleman, Mr Deputy Speaker, faces a real problem now. For example, he currently needs to buy an easement, a piece of land for $6,000. $6,000. His objective is to square off the block, and I think there are some water issues he needs to deal with around one of his abattoirs. The application fee, because Minister Joyce's or the Treasurer's new rules are cumulative, he needs to go to the Foreign Investment Review Board for a $6,000 bit of dirt, because he's already through the 15 million threshold, and he's not an Australian. He's not an Australian. The application fee, I wonder how much the member for Calare thinks the application fee might be, or the member for Hinkler. Would they think it's on a $6,000 block of land? Would it be $100? $1,000? $15,000, Mr Deputy Speaker. $15,000 for an application fee to the Foreign Investment Review Board to buy a block of dirt for $6,000. But it gets worse than that, because, as everyone in this place knows, when someone goes to an auction and makes a bid, they have to be in a position to close the deal. It can't be conditional. You can't bid at an auction and then ring up later and say, oh, I can't buy it now because, you know, I couldn't borrow the money, or my wife said I wasn't allowed to, or my husband said I wasn't allowed to be politically correct, whatever it might be. Well, gentlemen like the one I mentioned in my example can't do that. He can't do that now. He can't go and bid at auction for his $6,000 block of land. And why? I'm sure the member for Hinkler knows the answer to the question. Because he hasn't got Foreign Investment Review Board approval yet. And he can't. The timing is all wrong. So these are the simple but important things this government simply hasn't thought of. They haven't thought these issues through. But what they have thought through, Mr Deputy Speaker, is populism. Populism. We all know that out there are people concerned about Asian investment in agriculture land. But instead of showing leadership and reminding people and pointing out to people that the investment by, for example, the Chinese in our agricultural land is very, very small, in fact minute, in the total scheme of things, instead of going out there and showing leadership and reassuring people that they have nothing to fear, that in fact Chinese investment in our agriculture sector is a good thing, will be good for Australia, will be good for jobs, will be good for export earnings, and explaining that they can't pick up the land and take it with them, and explain that a sovereign country still maintains the right on export, for example, and what leaves this country. Instead of doing all of that, they're playing the game, sending the signal out. Don't worry, we won't let those Chinese come and get your farmland. Show some leadership. I challenge the member for Hinkler and the member for Calare to stand up in their party room to Minister Joyce, and in doing so, show some leadership. Now, Minister Joyce is very interesting because he went to the New South Wales Nationals conference on the weekend. I'm sure the member for Calare was there in the beautiful Hunter Valley. No doubt he enjoyed some excellent Hunter wine while he was there. And he declared to the conference, in a moment of mad populism, that he's not going to let any foreign-owned companies, government-owned foreign companies buy any agricultural land in this country. And if you have a look at Sue Neill's article today, you'll see there are many good examples of Government pension funds, for example. Imagine locking out the Norwegian pension fund from Australian agriculture. Can you imagine that idea? We're going to say to the Norwegians and their billions of dollars sitting there from their oil fund, you know, we're not going to let you buy anything in Australian agriculture. We're going to deny ourselves that opportunity. But of course he didn't have the Norwegians in mind, did he? Is that right? Is that right, colleagues? He didn't have the Norwegians in mind. He wasn't thinking about the Norwegians, was he? Of course he wasn't. I'll let others come to their own conclusions about that. But this week, back here in the Parliament, when his Prime Minister found out about this idea at the New South Wales National Conference, Minister Joyce has now got a different view of it. Oh no, he still believes that, he told the Australian, or a spokesman told the Australian. He still believes it, but he's not going to legislate it. He believes in it, but he's not going to do it, which is a fairly novel approach to one's ministerial portfolio, I would have thought. He believes this is what should happen, but he's not going to do anything about it. Well, the Prime Minister needs to haul him into line and have him come in here and make a statement about his intentions, because, unsurprisingly, there are a lot of investors out there, governments and their pension funds, for example, who don't know what the rules are going to be in a year's time or 2 years' time. Because Minister Joyce has made his views very, very clear to them. He sent the signal that if he had the opportunity at any time, he'd be locking them out of an opportunity to invest in Australia. So what are they to believe? They don't know. You're sitting in Beijing, maybe, or in Oslo, in London. They don't know what the rules are going to be tomorrow. So they just go elsewhere. They'll go to South America or elsewhere. Australia's just getting too hard. Why would they line up in a queue at the Foreign Investment Review Board in Australia behind God knows how many applications? And by the way, the government's given no indication whatsoever of any intention of more fully resourcing Treasury to handle this additional workload. They're taking something like $750 million additional, I think over 4 years, as demonstrated in the Treasurer's budget papers. $750 million additional from Foreign Investment Review Board applications, but haven't said one word about returning any of that back to Treasury to handle the extra workload involved here. So they look at Australia, they're behind a big queue of God knows how many applications we will now have. If my friend at Willards has to put an application in for a $6,000 block of dirt, I suggest to colleagues the queue's going to be pretty long, pretty long. Then they look at the fees, up to $100,000 or more, depending on the value of the land they are looking at. $100,000 for an application fee at the Foreign Investment Review Board. This is just a black hole. And now they have the minister saying, basically, first chance I'll get, you won't be allowed in here at all. So if someone's looking at an enterprise which to be ultimately successful will need additional land to meet those objectives, they don't know whether they're going to be able to buy that in 2 years' time. So they look at Australia and they just don't bother. That's what's going to happen. So I say to the minister, put the populism aside, please. Show some leadership, and get out there and explain to people, one, that they need not fear foreign investment in agricultural land, and at the same time send a signal to potential investors around the world that Australia is open for business. Isn't that what they told us before the last election, that Australia was going to be open for business? Here's the opportunity to do so. And I'm getting a lot of pressure from my colleagues, so I'll try to wind up. But Australia, as I said, has got no agriculture policy. We were promised an agriculture white paper. Now, if the minister was here, he'd say, well, I'd like to think he might say, yeah, you're right, we don't have any agriculture policy, but don't worry, the white paper's coming. Well, I don't know whether the white paper is going to be a document of quality or not. I'm feeling very pessimistic, I might say, that it will be, because, as one of Minister Joyce's colleagues infamously told a journalist, somewhat infamously, it's full of every crackpot idea of the last 20 years. Now, my fear is that the more it bounces from Minister Joyce's office to the Treasurer's office to the Prime Minister's office and back again and around again a few times, it will ultimately be a document not of quality but of compromise. And I fear that means it'll be a a bit of a wish list and a promise on infrastructure projects which could never be completed or even started prior to an election in a year's time, let's say, and therefore useless. Not a strategic overarching document that provides guidance to the agriculture sector and its investors, but basically a pre-election policy document. Now, to the delight of my friends, I'll sit down and restate Labor's and the opposition's commitment to the bills. We will be supporting the bills, and on that basis I recommend them to the House, and I look forward to the member for Calare responding to some of those Foreign Investment Review Board issues that I raised.
I thank the Shadow Minister. The question before the chair is that this bill be now read a second time. I offer the call to the member for